This might be the best way to play Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS for under $100 US. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Joey's Retro Handhelds. I'm Joey, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive look into the TrimUI Smart Pro. This device was sent to me for review by litnxt.com, and as usual, they have no input in anything I say and haven't seen this video ahead of time. But if you are interested in this device, then check out my description for a link to where you can order it. Hey guys, Joey here. So after I'd completely filmed this video and edited it, LitNXT dropped the price of this to $74 US shipped. So this is a lot better than it initially was when I started reviewing it. So just sub in anytime I'm talking about under $100, you can now sub in basically under $80. Right off the bat, the key thing to note about this handheld is it looks like a Vita, and it's pretty much the exact same size as a Vita, and it's extremely light. This is 230 grams. This is a bit smaller, it's a few millimeters off in every direction as far as compared to the Vita goes, but for today, just imagine that it's basically a Vita. Now, the absolute standout feature of this device is the screen, and it's a 4.96 inch 720 by 1280 screen, and that's a 16 by 9 aspect ratio for those that are counting. Playing Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS games on this screen is the best experience you're gonna have for under $100 US with no competition. They just look fantastic, and that continues with other systems as well, but I find these two to be the most unique ones in this price range. Power-wise, this is a tough one to pin down. You can easily play up to PlayStation 1 and comfortably with enhanced resolution on if you wanted. Then you can do some Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PlayStation Portable here. Now, with this aspect ratio, PSP is one of the consoles that you'll likely want to be able to emulate. And that's going to be game dependent as well as how much effort you want to put in. Out of the box, some games were running well and others needed tweaks. The easiest obviously is adding frame skip, but some others needed a bit more. So let's just jump into a tour of the device so you know what you're getting into. First up, we have a smaller than usual D-pad here, but surprisingly, it's a very accurate D-pad. Pulling up the Pokemon test to see if the character moves in any other direction, and it doesn't. Honestly, I've enjoyed this D-pad quite a bit while playing Super Mario World as well as some other games, and there's no real complaints on my end. It's definitely a good D-pad to use. That continues into the face buttons, and despite that they're a bit on the smaller side than I'd like, the buttons actually feel really good, and they're easy to push. These are clicky buttons with basically no travel, and I've been told that they're the same ones that are on the TrimUI Smart. But again, I've never had that device, so I can't really comment. Then we move down to the other buttons here, and we have Menu, Select, and Start. It's a nitpick, but I would have liked to see Start and Select up top and on separate sides. But these are big enough buttons and easy to press, and I have no complaints. The menu button is one that you're going to be using a lot, as you save, load, or change settings through it. And then we get to the sticks, and remember the Vita comparison? Well, there's no L3 and R3 here. The sticks don't push down. These sticks aren't my favorite in the world, and I think they could have done a lot better. In all honesty, I might say this a few times today, but I would just avoid any games that use the sticks and just forget they exist. In my personal opinion, I just assume that this device only has a D-pad and face buttons. One other weird thing is you see the speaker cutouts here on the front, but that's actually not where the sound comes out of. Well, it does, but that's not actually where the speakers are located. My wife and I were playing a game of locate the speakers with this device for a good 10 minutes. But we came to the conclusion that they're behind the back and in the middle of the device. Surprisingly, the device doesn't sound bad at all with that in mind, but it's a weird design decision. Continuing that thought, and we moved up to the top here, and we have the L1 and R1 buttons, power button, a host USB-C port, which I haven't found a use for, and we have volume buttons. Power and volume buttons feel pretty great, basically exactly what you'd want them to do. But we get to the triggers now, and this one is a bit baffling. They're just too small. There's really no other way to put it. I understand exactly what they're going for here, and they wanted an extremely slim, lightweight device and wanted to slim down the triggers as well, but I think they went a little bit too far and made them basically a useless addition. I'll be honest, out of everything with this device, this is really the only bad thing that I can point to. And hopefully you're starting to see the reasons I pointed to using this device as just a dedicated Game Boy Advance and Nintendo DS machine, as the rest of the controls aren't that great compared to the D-pad and the face buttons. They're fine enough to use for hotkeys, but even that is pushing it a little bit in my opinion. On the bottom, we have a function slide, which I have to keep enabled, as if you turn this off, it puts the system in a battery saver mode, and that downclocks the CPU. You want FN mode on at all times, unless you'll only be playing something like just Game Boy. But even something like Game Boy Advance has some slowdown even in power save mode. Then there's a covered up port, which I'm not sure what it is, USB-C charging slot, a microphone input, which is weird to see, SD card slot, and headphone jack. On the back, we have nothing but nice curved sides. They really went for ergonomics here first, and you can definitely feel that. As a whole, this device rivals my Anbernic RG353PS for most comfortable device that I think I've ever used and own. I just can't understate how nice this feels, from the curves to the back that feels nice and just the way that you can hold it. This is extremely comfortable and it's extremely lightweight as well. They did a fantastic job here. If you saw my Powkitty RGB30 review, you know that I wasn't exactly happy with that device and the ergonomics, but I thought the screen was pretty nice. But here you have an equivalent or better screen, a better ergonomic device, more comfortable by a large margin, and it can do everything that the RGB30 can do for around the same price. This is everything I wanted the RGB30 to be, but wasn't, and thankfully now I have it. Let's do some size comparisons so you can see where this fits in. Unfortunately, I don't have a Vita on hand, but from what I pulled up spec-wise and dimension-wise, they're basically the exact same, again minus just a few millimeters of difference. The closest comparison that I have on hand is the Anbernic RG353PS, and this is just slightly bigger than that on the width, but it's about the same height. And it's a similar story for the Anbernic RG405M. This is wider by maybe half an inch on both sides, and about the same height, with the TrimUI being just a bit taller. Then we have the Retroid Pocket 2S, and while they're just about the same height, the TrimUI is about an inch or so wider than that is. The real story here is just how thin and light this feels. I'm a big fan of that. I'm not sure I would classify this as pocketable with how most people define it, but I would definitely call it portable and something that you can bring with you on the go and easily. For me, that means just throwing this in my sling bag. But there's definitely coat pockets that this would fit into. Let's take a look at the screen, and the first device I want to compare it with is the Retroid Pocket Flip. The colors are wildly different on both the Flip and the TrimUI, with the Flip having a much brighter screen, but the TrimUI doesn't look as washed out in comparison. I don't know if washed out is the right term, but that's just the best way I can describe it. And now with the AYN Odin 2 Pro, which I find the colors on the Odin 2 Pro to be much nicer looking. But obviously these are in two much different weight classes. Lastly, with a device that has been mostly a dedicated Game Boy Advance machine up until now, the Anbernic RG351P. They're so very close here that it's just easy to call this the big brother to the Anbernic RG351P. The screen, like I shared before, is just the standout here, and it looks fantastic. Despite it being 16:9, this is a fantastic way to play a lot of retro games, as long as you don't mind the black bars. Moving over to the sound portion, and let's have a quick listen to the speakers. Like I said before, these aren't the worst speakers for under $100, but they're not the best either, especially for them being right at the back of the device. They sound better than they have any right to be, but I wouldn't consider these top of the line speakers. On the battery front, they stayed about 5 hours for this battery, and I'd say that's pretty accurate with what I'm seeing in my testing. I will say that I barely lost any charge leaving it overnight in sleep mode, which is a good thing to see, especially on Linux. Operating system wise, we're running a custom Linux build from TrimUI. It's pretty bare bones at the moment, and it basically acts as a front end for RetroArch, Drastic, and the other emulators they're using. You can change brightness, the LED brightness of the sticks, volume, Wi-Fi, key map to rotate 90 degrees, and CPU frequency as well if you want to keep it at a certain range. Wi-Fi means retro achievements for my fellow achievement hunters. My dev unit didn't come with a manual, so I'm not sure if there's a hotkey shortcut for this, but I'd love to see the ability to adjust brightness in the menu while in game. Right now it doesn't have that option, and the only way to adjust brightness is through the menu outside of the game. But again, there might be a hotkey for this that I'm missing. Most of the systems are locked down with core overrides, and other things that make it just a bit difficult to adjust settings for. As long as you're familiar enough with how RetroArch works, with core overrides and all of that, you can open things up a little bit. But for instance, if you wanted to use GPSP instead of MGBA for Game Boy Advance, there's no current way to do so, or at least no easy way that I've found. Also, this device has Wi-Fi, and I wasn't able to get my Retro Achievements username and password saved in RetroArch without editing the config file directly on my computer in Notepad. Silly things like that, which could just be a skill issue on my part of not finding the right way to do it, but it does make things a little bit more difficult for the average user. Now, the good thing is the TrimUI team has been very communicative with me behind the scenes, and I've been passing along things that I find, and they've been extremely quick with fixing them. So I fully expect any roadblocks to be removed for the time that this releases. But as always, I have to share what the current state looks like. Honestly, my only major annoyance out of everything was having the overlays as default when you boot up a game, and it pixelates your game a little bit and adds the graphics to the side. Thankfully, that's a super easy fix of hitting their menu button, advanced menu, on-screen overlay, and unchecking display overlay. Then you just back out, overrides, and save core overrides. Once you do that, you get the full awesomeness of this display without ruining it with overlays and pixelation. Now, this is my first TrimUI device, so if you've had one before, you might be familiar with how all this works. For example, knowing the folder structure to add new systems or new games. I wanted to add Game Gear, and that folder wasn't there, so I created a folder called GG and added my games in there. It didn't show up. Then I tried Game Gear written out, and that didn't work either. I asked them for support, and they just told me throw it in the MS folder because it uses the same core. So it's little things like that that I don't have documentation for because I don't have a manual, which might be in there and it might not be, but that's just kind of what I have to live with. Okay, let's jump into some games, and I'll show you what runs perfectly first before we jump into the systems that need some tweaks. First up is Game Boy, and it just looks great here on this screen. I won't be stretching any of the systems I'm playing. They're all just going to be in their native aspect ratio and no widescreen hacks or anything like that. But like I mentioned, I do want to remove all of the overlays from all of the systems. Next up is Game Boy Color, and it's more of the same. As long as you don't mind the bars on the side, which the beauty of the screen more than makes up for, you would have a great time here. The quintessential experience on this device is Game Boy Advance, and it's all thanks to the screen and the controls. For years, we've been asking Ambernick to make a better RG351P with a 3:2 aspect ratio and more power. Well, with this, we have the power part and the larger screen, and it's close enough with the aspect ratio. Also, for Pokemon fans, you can easily 3 times the frame rate for fast forward in Game Boy Advance games, and it makes it easy to grind out some Pokemon. Don't worry, if I haven't hit you over the head with it enough already, I'm going to keep doing so. Game Boy Advance on this is fantastic. Looking at Nintendo DS, and again, this might be the best way to play both of these systems for under $100, as long as you don't mind the lack of touchscreen. Now, for some reason I can't show the speed as it's bugged currently, so I'll just have to share how I feel. And if that wasn't reason enough, you can fast forward and you can see how much headroom we actually have, and how much faster you can grind in Nintendo DS Pokemon games. Honestly, the only thing missing from this experience for Nintendo DS is retro achievements. Hopefully, Drastic can add it at some point. Now, if you don't mind the bars, I'd argue that Super Nintendo, NES, and other systems are great here as well. And it just always comes back to how nice the screen is, combined with these controls and the ergonomics. The whole package just feels great, and Super Nintendo looks and feels great. Jumping into PlayStation 1, and you'll have a great time here just out of the box. Nothing special to change, but you can enable enhanced resolution if you'd like. As is though, you can safely and easily play everything that I've shown so far. So let's jump into the bonus consoles here, and we can start with Nintendo 64, and as always, Nintendo 64 will be a bit of a mixed bag. Surprisingly, this runs Nintendo 64 out of the box a lot better than pretty much any custom firmware that I've used. So it has that going for it. There's going to be some games that just won't run, or need heavy tweaks to run, but as long as you're okay with that, you could have a good time here.
Spider sense tingling. Something's going on here.
Next up, we have Sega Dreamcast, and it's a similar story to Nintendo 64. There's a lot that's playable here out of the box without issue. And while it's not always at full speed, it's close enough for a lot of people. Then let's take a look at PlayStation Portable. And this matches the device's 16:9 aspect ratio and should technically be a good way to play this. In reality, I struggled a bit with PSP and I couldn't find the right settings to get the games to be completely playable. The out-of-the-box experience isn't great, in my opinion, so you'll likely have to play with some tweaks to get a good experience, but I do think it is possible here. I'm not the tweaking person, and especially for PSP, so besides auto frame skip, I wouldn't even know where to start. But if you are that person, I think there's room here to do those type of things. Now, as always, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PlayStation Portable are what I would consider to be bonus consoles on this device. I wouldn't suggest buying this for them, but they're more of a, if you have time to tweak, you could try it scenario and maybe get some good games playable. Let's wrap up my thoughts. So I'm kind of in love with this device, and it shouldn't come as a shock to anybody that's been following my channel to know that I like a device that has comfort and ergonomics first, and just feels great to play on. The D-pad, the screen, the face buttons, and all of that for under $100 US just makes this a no-brainer to me. I think software-wise, there's still some work to do. But if you follow my recommendations for what I think is the best out of the box, then none of those problems should affect you. For the most part, the only things that are missing are quality of life improvements and little additions and things like that. It would be awesome to see the ability to transfer ROM files over HTTP like you can do in ArcOS, for example. But as usual, I don't ever recommend anything based off of future potential. That's gross to me. I'd rather review something based off of what it is today and not what it's going to be in the future, because a lot of times projects get abandoned, devices get abandoned, and it's just not a good time for anybody. So, based off of today and the way the device acts today, I can confidently recommend it as a Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and that type of device. And you can even include 4:3 aspect ratio games in this as well. So all of your Super Nintendo, Nintendo, Genesis, and all of that, I think they play really well here, and this is a great horizontal device to do all of that in. If you're looking to play Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PlayStation Portable, and those, I would consider those bonus options here and wouldn't purchase this device for that specifically. This honestly just feels like a better Anbernic RG351P or Anbernic RG353P. It has that same sort of design as the 353P does, so it's a lot more comfortable too, but it just feels like that with a much better screen. I know I've said it a few times now, but before this, I wouldn't have recommended anything in that Miu Mini Plus to Retroid Pocket 2S price range, so between $50 and $100 US. I think those are the best tiers. But after seeing this device, I can easily and confidently recommend it in that price range, in that middle little scenario, and I think it's a really good device for a lot of people. That's going to be it for this one. Let me know in the comments below. Is this on your radar at all? Did I maybe convince you to maybe look at it for Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and the rest? I think we could use a lot more options for horizontal in this price range, and it's good to see that TrimUI has brought out something that's really, really good. Don't forget to like and sub to help this channel grow, and hope you all have a good one.